Alright everyone, I have to start off today by refuting a tweet by Gab. Sort of rubbed me the wrong way there. It was funny, and by the way, some people were like, well, that's it, I'm leaving Gab or something. That's not helpful. It's, you can have a dissent over things and call them out when they're wrong without acting like a social justice warrior. But I'm going to read the tweet here and then I'm going to pick it apart and refute it and speak at length about libertarianism a bit as well. This is the Gab tweet. There are no conservative values without Christianity. Libertarianism is inherently not conservative. Don't get it twisted. Libertarianism's end result is young kids being flashed at drag queen story hour, heroin overdoses, and mass migration. Live and let live, bro. Now, first I'm going to go through the three specific problems that are listed here and denote why libertarianism is not remotely involved in them being problems. Firstly, drag queen story hour. When you have overtly sexual situations involving minors, that violates the NAP. I have never seen a libertarian seriously argue outside of the context of mocking the fringe of Ancapistan. I've never seen a libertarian suggest that that sort of behavior is proper and doesn't violate the rights of those children. When you have adults doing that, it's wrong. And that's not just a subjective opinion. When the founders framed the Constitution, the concept of the age of majority matters. Well, children aren't at the age of majority. They can't vote. There are certain rights that they don't have. By the way, their further rights, their safety, is guaranteed and is part of the proper function of a state. Yes, making sure that children are not being abused is a function of state. A state's proper role is to prevent abuse. When it grows too large or too encumbered or too bureaucratic and strangulated that it becomes the abuser, that's when you have problems. The libertarian position ranges from a bit less government and abuse and the reformation fundamentally of the governing system to total statelessness. I'm on the prior end. I believe in less government. I believe in more constrained government. I would like to expand the Constitution. I think censorship should be completely constrained. Yes, corporations that take any form of subsidy, grant, or contract should be part of that as well. I would rapidly and massively, if given the power, expand all of those protections. I believe the Second Amendment pertains to machine guns. I don't care if people find that non-pragmatic. It was once the case in the U.S. You used to be able to get a Tommy gun in the mail. For some reason, gun crime was not particularly prevalent at the time. Could have been society was more polite and people were heavily armed and they were afraid of fucking with one another, but that's just me. More government is usually prescribed as the answer to problems. It usually fails. Look at the progressive era, for example. Now, I like Teddy Roosevelt. I think he was one of the greatest American presidents, but the progressive era had good and bad points. Good point, busting up trusts and monopolies. That's a capitalistic behavior. Preventing anti-competitive practices encourages capitalism. But then you get some of the other overt regulations, and they go beyond the level that's necessary or proper. Libertarians can also additionally, and I'll point this out, be pragmatic. Libertarianism is not, we're abolishing the state, there's no rules, do whatever you want. Libertarianism is the radical notion that when the government becomes too large or too involved in people's lives, it becomes the source of the abuse it is properly incepted to prevent. That's basically what it boils down to. So no, drag queen story hour violates the rights of those children. They should not be exposed. And by the way, it doesn't matter if it's a drag queen or anybody else. An adult should not be flashing children. That's pretty obvious. I haven't even seen many leftists argue in favor of this. I've seen a lot of people who are socialists saying, well, this is just fucking weird, and by the way, at this point, we're purity spiraling, and we're going to kill off the left entirely. By the way, good riddance. Number two, heroin overdoses. If you're talking about the opioid epidemic, that was created by a collusion between big government hyper-regulating the medical industry and pharma monopolies that have been created by big government, largely by liberals. That's where it comes from. They peddled that dope to people like fucking candy for years and years. How the hell did libertarians result in that problem? By the way, why are the opiates so cheap? Because of world policing. What do you think we were doing over in Afghanistan that whole time, in those poppy fields? You have pictures of U.S. soldiers sitting there grinning. They probably popped a couple pods in their mouth. They're having a great time. By the way, more power to them. On Uncle Sam's dime, go ahead and get your fix, I suppose. The opioid epidemic is not the responsibility of libertarianism. A libertarian approach to the drug problem would be people should be able to use heroin. Yeah, the government shouldn't be throwing people in jail for what is essentially victimless behavior. And by the way, as a pragmatist libertarian, I don't have a problem with treatment facilities. Yeah, go ahead and fund them. It's not violating anybody's fundamental rights. The whole taxation as theft thing can be taken as a subtle form of mockery of excessive states, or it can be taken as a utopian statement. I take it as the former. I don't have a problem with the concept of having an organized society. When abuse occurs, that's when you have a problem. The heroin epidemic has been caused by government. And by the way, if you're talking about drugs in general, I would say yes, people should use them. There are exceptions. If you're drinking and driving, that poses an imminent risk to other people on the road. The same is true of most drugs. Smoking a cigarette or whatever. If you're smoking in an enclosed area, if you're wandering around out in public harassing other people, there are other behaviors attendant to the substance use that make it situationally inappropriate. The substance itself, though, I don't care if you want to drop acid. Just do it in on your own lawn or something. If you start seeing elephants falling out of the sky, just don't try to stop traffic or something. Govern yourself. Most people, by the way, can do that. The idea of the uber scary mythology of reefer madness or acid craze, ecstasy will burn holes in your brain is bullshit by and large. So that's government propaganda too. By the way, the taxpayers had to fund that shit to the tune of billions of dollars. We're spending a huge amount of money incarcerating people for what essentially is victimless. The heroin epidemic was caused largely by the medical apparatus. Number 3 here, mass migration. There are some libertarians that advocate open borders. I'm not challenging that. Again, that's something that's debated within the vast core of libertarianism because it is a system of sub-ideologies. As a pragmatist, I say open borders is not compatible long-term with libertarianism. It's not. Because what ends up happening is, let's say that you eliminate borders entirely. Let's say we take it to the left-wing utopian extent. No borders. Anyone can come in. What would prevent the nation of China from saying, okay, we're going to send 100 million communists over there that are going to vote communism into power, scrap the libertarian state, subjugate the United States to China, dismantle its nuclear system, become a cabbage patch, and then they can come back and be commies back over here. Nothing. Now, this may seem like a weird scenario, but when you're talking about a utopian ideology, you can make up all sorts of utopian scenarios. It's a perfectly apt, perfectly appropriate thing to do, because you're talking about a utopian situation. The idea of open borders is a terrible one. It's not being championed by libertarians, it's being championed by the far left. These are the same people, by the way, that want to maintain and even expand the welfare state. Now, if you threw open the borders and then eliminated all forms of social welfare, I think you might even be able to make that work, because the tendency would be only hardworking people would come in, and socialists don't work very hard and communists never do. But, you know, that's a different argument you can make. And when people say, well, conservatives are not libertarians and vice versa, yeah, kind of. Libertarians overlap with conservatives in certain areas, insofar as conservatives tend to be fixated on less taxation, or the government should get its hands off guns or whatever. Tech censorship, arguably at this particular juncture, although that's changing unfortunately. Yeah, there's overlap. But libertarians also tend to overlap with not giving a damn if people are gay and stuff like that. Yeah, it's, in that sense, it's not social conservatism. So, it's a different ideology. How does that make libertarianism responsible for the ills of liberalism? They're totally different ideologies. If you're primarily fixated on thinking that the left, in the social sense, has created a degenerate society, yes, you probably have a thing against libertarians too. If, on the other hand, your primary beef with the left is fiscal, you probably side with them. What I see here is that Gab is taking up a socially conservative viewpoint, which I think is self-admitted. That's perfectly fine. That doesn't mean that libertarians, by overlapping with the left situationally, are responsible for any of the problems you perceive. And as I'm pointing out, your criticism of libertarianism here isn't even right. Libertarians didn't design U.S. drug policy, or drug policies really anywhere. They're not permissive, they're far left. All of these inner city police forces that are involved with the corruption of the drug war tend to be run by commissioners that are handpicked by a bunch of far left bleeding heart Democrats. Again, not a single libertarian involved. The libertarians are saying end the drug war, get people treatment, that's fine. Libertarianism does not have to be anarchy. The idea that it argues for a stateless society, you're confusing us, I believe, with anarcho-communists. or something along those lines. Yeah, I would slash the, maybe 75% of government apart and reduce what's left, but that doesn't mean I advocate for the removal of a state. I advocate for the fact that the state has functioned better in times long past when there was considerably less government regulation. We need to have 90% less laws. Monopolies shouldn't even technically have to exist. In the absence of a state that's empowering them to do so, they largely wouldn't. We can take care of the rest whenever they spring up situationally. You've got something new, like rail lines are going up everywhere, and a couple companies happen to run them all because it's a fairly new industry. You're going to tend to get trusts and monopolies. You'll have to bust them apart. Well, then just make sure that you don't have another era of carpetbagging. That was largely the result in that era of North-South identity politics, which ironically, again, dwelled in big government. That's just the way that it works. Centrality is corruption. The United States was incepted to be a society in which government was understood to be limited, and in which government was understood the proper role was to prevent abuse. It fields a military to keep foreign powers from abusing you. It fields internal policing to keep domestic abuse at a minimum, to quell insurrection that could rip the state apart and disenfranchise everyone who has property, to make sure that there's a justice system in place so that people who violate the rights of others can be prosecuted in a reasonable manner. What I am saying is that the state has taken those basic powers and rapidly and massively expanded them beyond all boundaries to the point where the state is the primary source of abuse that we see today. It's not private corporations, unless empowered by the government, by the way. It's not foreign powers. None of them can stand a chance against the U.S. military. It's the U.S. government. For Americans, the U.S. government has become abusive. I advocate reducing the size and scope of government. I don't advocate abolishing it. That's another thing. Sometimes libertarians get stereotyped as like they wear a Gadsden flag and they've got a bong in one hand and a Tommy gun in the other, and that's considered libertarianism. That's a funny meme. It is true of some fringe anarcho-capitalists, but by and large libertarians, I think like 90% of us are probably just limited government types. That has nothing to do with trying to enable child abuse or people to shoot up heroin in the streets. It's just that's the far off the priority list. I think reducing taxation and censorship and taking care of some of these actual important issues, I think are prioritized even by libertarians that are kind of far out there. It's sort of like comparing, someone is like a center-left Democrat. They're like, well, I kind of want to give welfare to people and a little taxation's okay. We want, go back to renewable energy sources or something. It's sort of like comparing that to someone with pink hair who amputates their limbs and gets triggered all the time and can't even go outside and sits there shitposting on Tumblr all day. It's a big difference between the two ideologically. The fact that they're considered on the same line doesn't mean they're not at opposite ends of that line. So that would be a refutation of Gab. The social problems you're listing were caused by big government and its allies. They weren't caused by small government advocates or by Libertarian Party members. By the way, I don't even agree with the LP on all issues. I don't believe in open borders. I think if you maintain the welfare state, you can't have open borders, otherwise you slowly destroy your culture, which is the problem that we currently face in the United States and much of the Western world. And the idea that you have to admit people to your culture that are openly hostile towards you is asinine. I don't see libertarians arguing for that. Some anarcho-purists, maybe so, but, at some point, you're arguably just replacing the abuse of the state with the abuse of other groups, which is exactly why I'm not a statelessness advocate either, because I think that it's a crazy idea. That's about all. Peace out.